Welcome. My name is Bianca Collins. I'm the curator of public programs for the Fowler Museum at UCLA. Fowler Museum's doors reopened to the public on July 1, and we are thrilled to be welcoming visitors back to the galleries. But for now, we are continuing to offer our programs virtually. So thank you for joining us today or tonight, depending on where it is you're tuning in from around the world. Photo Cameroon, Studio Portraiture 1970 to 1990s features more than 110 black and white images by Jacques Toussele, Joseph Chila, and Samuel Finlak, who ran successful photo studios during Cameroon's post-independence era. Their clients often chose specific dress, props, and poses to show their cultural, political, and religious affiliations, musical preferences, important relationships, vocations, leisure activities, and more. These portraits expand our knowledge of life and individuality in Cameroon and offer glimpses of communities that were and continue to be diverse, vibrant, and responsive to change. I'm pleased to give a special shout out to the photographers' family members who have joined us in the audience today. Today's program will include a welcome by the co-curator of the exhibition, the Fowler's Curator of African Arts, Erica P. Jones, a sneak peek at the exhibition with Erica and co-curator David Zeitlyn, professor of social anthropology at the University of Oxford, and a pre-recorded conversation with Sam van Schaik, head of the British Library's Endangered Archives program, which was instrumental in digitizing Toussele's photo archive. An audience question and answer will wrap things up. Before we get going, I have two quick technical bits of housekeeping. Once the screen sharing begins, I encourage you to click view options at the top of your Zoom screen and select side-by-side mode so the video feed doesn't cover any of the presentation. And if you have any questions during this program, please do submit them through the Q&A function found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. That's enough from me. Over to you, Erica and David.
Thank you so much, Bianca. I also want to wish everyone a good morning, good afternoon, or a good evening, wherever you may be. I'm overjoyed to be able to welcome you to our opening program for the exhibition, Photo Cameroon, Studio Portraiture, 1970s, 1990s. This exhibition features the work of three incredibly talented photographers, Joseph Chila, Samuel Finlak, and the late Jacques Toussele. I feel like we can't say their names frequently enough. While Chila and Finlak could not join us today, I'm so pleased that we have my co-curator, David Zeitlyn, here. So a few years ago, David was in Los Angeles and he came to visit us at the Fowler Museum to propose an exhibition. After decades of working with Chila, Finlak, and Toussele, he was hoping we'd be interested in exhibiting their photographs. I would say he knew his audience pretty well in pitching this exhibition to us. As someone who myself has spent over a decade working in a similar region in Cameroon, I couldn't help but be intrigued by these photographs. And upon finally seeing the images, I had the experience that I really hope many of you joining us today will have, which is just sort of the unbridled excitement at seeing this era of Cameroon that is opened up by these images. I personally find it really impossible to look at these and not have just a great desire to learn more about the people in these photos. They're really fantastic. So in organizing this exhibition, our goals were really twofold. And Bianca touched on some of this. I'm going to say it again because I think it's really important. First and foremost, by showing the work of these artists, we have an opportunity to expand the canon of African photography. For the thousands of incredible photographers who have worked across the continent for the past century, the names of only a few are really widely known. And so it's our hope that by showcasing the work of these three artists, we'll expand that list just a bit. Our second goal was to use these photographs to take a close look at this moment in Cameroonian history, a task that was greatly aided by the incredible depth of the archives that we were working with to select the images. The photographs of sitters from the 1970s to the 90s give the viewers to this exhibition a sense of the local experience in Cameroon as the sort of immediate post-independence of the late 1960s faded into the national culture that more closely resembles the Cameroon of today. in these photos, we really see the plurality of cultures and religions that characterize this region. We see youth culture, older generations, rural populations, urban. Um, and in all of this, we see just how multifaceted this area was and still is today, which, while highlighting the complexity of the region, also betrays just how little we can show in a mere 110 images. It's really, there's so much more there. Um, and while I could go on about our lofty intentions for this exhibition, I would be remiss for not pointing out one really simple motivation behind exhibiting these works. And it's that the photographs are just wonderful. They're really just wonderful. They are dynamic, they are engaging, and they speak to the vitality of the studio space and of the photographic culture of Cameroon. And so, there's just a joy in looking at these photos. Before I get down to the business of showing you some of these photos, which we will be able to do in a minute, I have a few thank yous to relate. First, to my many talented, dedicated colleagues here at the Fowler. Every exhibition that we mount at the museum requires a great deal of collaboration. And the people with each exhibition, the people I work with astonish me with their ingenuity, their creativity, and their ability to roll with just about anything. So thank you to everyone on staff. I'm honored to be counted among you. A special thanks to our former director, Marla Burns, for her thoughtful guidance on this project as well. I also personally want to thank my co-curator, David Zeitlyn. David has been such a responsive, generous partner throughout this whole process. Your unfettered excitement to continue to look at these images after he has spent, and he has totaled this up quite literally over 14 days of his life. That would be 14 24-hour periods of his life looking at these images. So his ability to still just have so much joy at looking at these photos has made this whole process really, really fun. Finally, I'd like to note that support for this exhibition comes from the Fowler Museum Exhibition Fund and the J.T. Last and Deborah R. Last Endowment. And without all of our supporters, we wouldn't be able to do what we do, and we're really forever grateful. So enough of an intro. Let's look at some photographs. We're gonna offer you a sneak peek. We're not gonna do a full walkthrough here. We're just gonna give you some little tastes. And we hope that this will entice you to come in and see the show in person. And what we're gonna do here is I'm gonna take the first half of the show, and then David is gonna take you on a little bit of a tour of the second half of the show. So I will now share my screen. So, as I said, we can't say these photographers' names enough. So now we will show you images of them as well. I wanted to introduce you to the three photographers with self-portraits that they took of themselves. The top left, we have, as they are noted, Jacques Toussele, Samuel Finlak in the bottom left, and on the far right, Joseph Chila. And so jumping into, we've broken this into 6 sections. And so starting with section 1, this first section of the exhibition, we begin by looking at the important social roles that photographers play in documenting the lives of local citizens, local people, really, as citizens of a nation state, as individuals, and as members of a community. So in practical terms, what that means really, this involved 3 types of photographs that these photographers were taking. The first we see in this slide here. The first type of photograph, these were passport style images for national identity cards, for business and driver's licenses and other official documents. These were bureaucratic photographs, basically. From the mid 1950s, the Cameroonian government, really the colonial French government that then became the Cameroonian government, mandated that all adults must carry an identity card with a photograph. And since cameras were not widely available, this really they weren't widely available until the 90s. This really spurred a professional studio field. And this created an incredible income stream for photographers. This income stream then came to an abrupt end in 1998 when the government started taking ID photos in the issuing offices for these, especially for identity cards. So this is one type of photograph that was incredibly important that these photographers were taking. The other two types we see here, the second and third, we have portraits, as we see on the left. These are mainly taken in studios of individuals, families, and groups. And on the right, documentation of community-based social events, really. So, you know, while the bulk of their time was dedicated to taking identity card photos, this allowed photographers to charge really reasonable rates for photos like the ones we see here, for studio portraits and for this kind of documentary work, which made it more accessible to local communities. So while these, excuse me, commissioned photographs on, as we see on the right, of documentary topics were a little less common, the frequency with which these photographers were taking these studio portraits was really very high. People were coming in frequently to have portraits taken, even if they also came in to have an ID photo taken. So this is sort of our introduction to what a photographer does in Cameroon during these 3 decades. The second section takes us into the studio, takes us to give us a look at what the studio experience was like. You know, Toussele, Finlak, and Chila, they did the majority of their work inside their studios. Toussele's, and their studios differed actually. Toussele's was an indoor space located on a main street in the city of Mbuda. Chila's was an indoor space, but he also worked outdoors sometimes. And Finlak mainly set up outdoors working with natural light. He frequently used painted, or like we see in this central image here at the top, printed cloth as backdrops to sort of delineate a space that we would think of as a studio. So upon arriving at a studio, sitters would have the opportunity to consult a display board of images selected by the photographers as examples of poses, attire, different ways to set the studio up. And then in collaboration with the photographer, the sitters would then stage the scene using the backdrops and props. And so what we see here are, in this slide I'm showing you, the top row, we have backdrops that were used by each of the photographers, representing the 3 photographers. You know, many photographers like Toussele and Chila, they kept these hand-painted backdrops in their studios, and these would frequently be painted by itinerant artists who traveled around the region. And as David had pointed out to me, that sometimes the photographers would actually obscure the names of the painters so that they could sort of keep it secret who was painting their especially successful backdrops. You know, just a little bit of rivalry going on here. Photographers with less stationary studios sometimes use the printed cloth, and that's sort of another kind of dynamic way of creating these photos that Finlak engaged throughout his career. Some photographers also kept props available for sitters in their studios. Many individuals also brought their own props. They would bring personal possessions that spoke to aspects of their identity, how they wish to be seen, how they wish to be remembered for posterity. But in the bottom 2 images here, we see 2 very popular props that were offered in Toussele's studio. On the left, a plastic tree that shows up time and again in these photographs. You know, it looks kind of like a Christmas tree to us. It wasn't necessarily thought of that way by the sitters. And then on the right, we have maybe Toussele's most important tool as a photographer besides his camera, which is his motorcycle. This is something that, you know, we had so many options of photographs of young men posing with Toussele's motorcycle to choose from. We only selected 2, but we could have filled a wall with these. It was a very popular prop to borrow from. In the third section of the exhibition, we start to explore what we can really know when we look at these photographs. You know, studio portraits, there's this element where they seem to show what we think of as truth or facts about the sitters, but in reality, they really only reflect slivers of who these individuals were or who they wish to be. And the studio creates this theatrical space for self-fashioning. It's an opportunity to transform oneself into the idea of who one is or who one wants to be or how they want to be perceived. And so what we can actually say or guess about the sitters without knowing them is somewhat limited. You know, that being said, there is something that we can say when looking at these photographs. There's still a fair amount that can be learned when looking at the props, the clothing, the poses, and the companions who they choose to be photographed with. This selection that we have, we feel really, it reveals these societal trends, these cultural backgrounds, individual interests, and community connections that were valued by many of the sitters who were coming to photographic studios in the 1970s through the 90s. And this also then reflects some of the larger developments and movements in Cameroon at the time. So these two photographs, I would say these are two of my favorites, but it's very hard to even say that, because I think all of us have felt like you have a new favorite every time you walk through the exhibition. So these two photos really show how sitters could present different aspects of themselves in front of the camera. We have two photographs of the same man, almost certainly taken on the same day. In one, he stands on the left, he stands with a child, presumably his own, and he wears a togo, which is the traditional dress of many cultural groups who live in this region of Cameroon. In the photo on the right, he appears with a woman, possibly his wife, probably his wife. And here he's wearing a suit. And you just see this sort of idea that we all have multiple facets for identity. And he has brought the clothing, to the sartorial choices to display those different important aspects of who he was. He has his business attire and his traditional attire, and this is a part of who he is as a family man. We also, in this section, explore some other sort of typical groupings, some other things we can pull out, couples, that there are so many wonderful photographs of couples in these archives. And you see sort of the way that people choose to share their relationships publicly, that you have these sort of more relaxed, more affectionate sort of couple at the bottom who is intertwined. You have this, the standing couple, these young people who are in some ways a little more formal. And then on the right, we also have, another couple who is taking this portrait where they are both dressed wearing much more formal clothing. And they have also included, emblems of their stature behind them to show who they are as an important couple in the community. Again, similar as we had in the first, in the image of the man wearing his togo with his child, we have another small section on grass fields, this region of Cameroon, on dress and also accoutrement, various indicators of status that people would bring to the studio with them. So here we have, a man with his gourd next to him, a palm wine gourd, holding a fly whisk, wearing his togo, and behind him an indoff cloth. All of these indicators of his senior status in his community, as well as we have this woman who has, again, a senior woman with her traditional woven bag and her fly whisk, who has come in to the studio with these to show her status in a grassfields community. Another very fun sort of grouping of photos we have here focus on hair. This was sort of one of those things that we noticed looking through. In the photo on the left, we have the photo on the left, the woman on the right, is wearing a dress that has a photograph on it of a young woman with this incredible looping hairstyle. As we noticed this dress, we started noticing so many images of women wearing this same hairstyle, as we see with Mofua Pierre's wife on the right. And this was something that just kept coming up. And we just see, it's just a glimpse of what was, a fashion and hairstyle at this time that was so widespread that he was even, on the clothing that women were wearing. A final selection from this section, we see people showing their taste in music, their international taste in music coming out in what they wear as well. So we had quite a number of people who chose to wear their Michael Jackson t-shirts, sweatshirts to the studio for their photographs. And this was just, another thing that when you're looking at I have not looked at all nearly 48,000 photos in the archive like David has, but when you're just looking at thousands of them, you start to notice these things as they pop up. And that was, a clear preference for the time. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to David to take us through the second half of the exhibition.
Thank you very much. Okay, do you want to move to the next slide, please? So the archive reflects a wide variety of different social and political factors, and one of the important ones, of course, in Cameroon is the single party which has been continuously in power since independence, with the two presidents. And here are cloth of the first president on the right, Ahidjo, and on the left, cloth from showing President Biya. Versions of these have been really helpful in putting some structure into the archive, because different cloth was produced by the party at different times, and so it helps us give some orientating points to help try and date the photographs, because we have very little documentation of on the in these archives. Next slide, please. Thank you. As well as party politics, there's a kind of international fashion politics going on. And so from the 70s and 80s, you can see the influence of things which kind of came to Cameroon through Paris Match and Vogue. So we have women wearing mini dresses on the right, and on the left we have my old friend Michel Legrand wearing flares, locally known as pied d'éléphant, elephant's foot trousers. That's a whole, I mean, this goes back to the pair of photographs that Erica was talking about, when you switch from traditional dress to some sort of more formal or different sort of formal European style dress, and how people present themselves, how they play with these alternative forms of self-presentation is one of the joys of these photographs. Next slide, please. As well as politics, there's religion. So one of Joseph Chila's painted backdrops shows the Kaaba in Mecca, and here on the right is a man standing in front of that backdrop, showing his traditional Islamic robes and showing off in the posing how voluminous they are. On the left is Pastor Noki, and his little button, the badge on his lapel, says "Live for Jesus." One of the interests about the Finlak archive is it's not only got Pastor Noki, but also his mother, who's also, her portrait is also in the exhibition. Next slide, please. I love these images. So these are actually sort of commercial, because these were taken to publicize Mauvais Grain Etienne Ledoux, because he was a commercial strongman, and would go from town to town in West Cameroon, and with his wife, they did things like pulling cars, yeah, showing off how strong they were in all different forms of not only strongman but also doing judo. One of the interests to me in this is that by the time I met him, he had become the chief of a sub-chiefdom in Bafu, for those of you who know Cameroon, and he'd actually had to shave off his dreadlocks to show how serious he now was, and he actually didn't have copies of any of these early photos, so he was very pleased to be able to get new copies. Next slide, please. Right, this is a section on self-portraiture, and Jacques Toussele's self-portraits are very different from the self-portraits of the other two. So the photograph on the left seems to show a policeman, and this was actually on display outside the studio. But because if you look carefully, it's not a self-portrait of an identity photo of a policeman. It's Jacques Toussele, who was never in the police force, dressed as a policeman. And he sort of enjoyed that some police people had criticized him and told him off for masquerading in this way. On the right is a photograph of him posing in the studio with this rather strange studio prop in the form of a rope tied to the ceiling. It actually appears in one of the early Christmas tree photographs we saw earlier. And sadly, I never was able to ask him about this because I didn't really notice the whole sequence until after he died. But I mean, there's a good number of these sorts of photographs. And so I don't have a good explanation of it. But the thing about Toussele's self-portraits is that he keeps popping up in his own photographs. And so I always think of it as being a bit like Alfred Hitchcock, who used to appear as an extra in his own films, which is very appropriate for Los Angeles, of course. Next slide, please. So the final section is about the archiving and how these photographs come to be available. So I first met Chila and Finlak because they are based near the village where my research as an anthropologist is based, and they had only a few thousand images. And Chila said one day when I was talking about this, really, if you're interested in more of them, we should go to Buda and meet the man who taught me photography, because he's never thrown anything away. And so eventually we went to Buda together, and although not everything has survived, Toussele had kept a huge number of photographs, most of which, as we've seen, are in very good condition, but some of the boxes in which he kept his old negatives had got damp and the emulsion had got badly damaged. In some cases, there was nothing. In a few cases, a good few cases, a few thousand, there is damage like the one we can see, which I think has a beauty all of itself. Next slide, please. And this will be the final slide, actually. And so among these damaged images, I was rather pleased to find this portrait of Toussele himself, taken by an apprentice such as Chila. And you can see on the back of his motorcycle, which we've already seen, you can see one of his cameras and the little briefcase he has. And so the scanning and the preservation of the negatives was done with the help of the Endangered Archive program, which is based at the British Library. No one from the British Library was available to be here today, but we were able to pre-record a discussion with them, and we will now turn to that. Thank you.
British Library. He is a specialist in Tibetan Buddhism and the Silk Road, with a particular emphasis on historical manuscripts. He's published extensively on these topics. He previously worked for the International Dunhuang Project at the British Library as well, and has just an extensive background in this region. But working for the Endangered Archives program, as we'll talk about, he has to really be a specialist in everything, I believe, in sort of the whole world. That's what's required of you. We're gonna jump in and get started here, and I'm just gonna direct the first question to Sam. And if you could just sort of introduce us to the Endangered Archives program, the EAP in general, how it started, what you do, how widespread this project is, because it really is quite an incredible program.
Yes, thanks, Erica. And I'd have to say I absolutely am not a specialist in everything, so it's wonderful to be able to learn from people like David about areas that I'm less knowledgeable about. Yes, so EAP stands for the Endangered Archives Programme, and it's run from the British Library in London. And it started in 2004. So back then, it was founded with a grant from the Arcadia Fund, which is a charity run by Elizabeth Rousing and Peter Baldwin. And they gave the library a chunk of money to disperse to projects around the world. And the thinking behind it was that there isn't necessarily much funding around for people who recognize kinds of material that are in danger of disappearing, but don't necessarily form the part of a kind of traditional research project or something like that. So the idea was that anybody who recognized material, it could be kind of traditional documentary archives, it could be sound recordings, manuscripts, it could be photographs, that were kind of either because they were just being held by in individual collections, or because there were political instability or environmental dangers in the area, that this material might disappear over the next few years. So the idea was that to give the funding mainly to preserve these through digitization, through photography or sound recording, and to keep digital copies in perpetuity, so that even if the original physical material did degrade or disappear, that this would be available, freely available to researchers for the coming generations. Some funding is also given to preserve the material, not through full conservation, but through sometimes moving it to somewhere that it may be safer, or through just moving it into proper kind of conservation grade boxes and that kind of thing. But largely the kind of thrust of EAP is preservation through digitization. So the funding also is kind of directed to places where it's felt that the infrastructure may not be there to do this. And so with the original kind of remit of EAP, the areas of North America and Western Europe are outside of our kind of funding remit. So we don't tend to fund projects in those areas or working on material in those areas. And there's also part of that, in that initial remit of EAP was to look at, to make sure that there's some capacity building going on in the country where the project was. So it's not just somebody kind of flying in, doing a sort of extractive digital project and then flying out again, but really building partnerships in the project, in the country. There should be an archival partner for each project in the country, which would be an organization that's able to benefit from the work. And that'll also be usually the place which will keep copies of their digital images in the country itself. So they're not just sitting outside of the country. So by endangered, as I've said, we mean material that's for any kind of reason really in danger of disappearing. And by archives, we mean a huge range of material, which includes not just traditional archives, but all kinds of documents, newspapers, periodicals, photographs, and so on. So the way that we do this, the way that we sort of just give money to projects and sort of make them happen is we have an annual funding round and a call in September for people to apply to us for funding. And we go through 2 stages, a preliminary application stage, and then inviting some people to make a detailed application. And then of those, we award around 30 projects every year. And as I've said, those projects will then send the material they create to us at the British Library, as well as having them kept in the country of origin. And we'll make those available on the EAP website, which is part of the British Library website. And that's a commitment the British Library's made kind of in perpetuity to both to store the images and to make them freely available. Now we have about 10 million of those images available on the EAP website, and from about over now, I'm not sure the exact number, but over 400 projects. So David's project, which was EAP 54, was one of the earliest, in fact, of EAP now, a venerable EAP project and a trailblazer.
That's a great segue.
Yes, I'll let you move on to.
No, let's. That's a great intro for David to jump in here and talk a bit about his very early illustrious EAP project. If you could maybe tell us a little bit about how you first, learned about the EAP and how you pitched the project and really sort of your background here with the EAP.
Thank you so much. In anticipation of this conversation, I've been racking my brains to remember how I first heard about EAP, and I have a horrible feeling that it was quite happenstance, really. I was at a committee meeting, which happened to be at the British Library. And it was one of these meetings where we were allocating grant funding for, I really can't remember what now, but over lunch, I had a conversation and I was explaining that I had started working on photography, and so this must have been 2004 or 5. So I was in the process of working with 2 photographers, and we'd organised an exhibition in Cameroon, and I think we were then in the process of organising an exhibition in London at the National Portrait Gallery. This is of Chila and Finlak, 2 of the photographers in our show. And by that stage, Chila had told me and had introduced me to Toussele, and I knew how much there was there, but I had no idea what on earth I could do with it, because the scale was clearly way beyond anything I could cope with. And so I was kind of talking about this, and someone said, well, look, just downstairs from this office, there's a group of people, we've just got this funding, that it sounds as though this would fit their remit, even though it's a private archive. There's no institutional basis there. So kind of before the meeting resumed, I popped down and said hello and described the project and said, would it fit? And they scratched their heads and said, what? Yes, basically. So after that very brief conversation, I went back, looked them all up, and put in an application. And then there were all these inevitable toing and froing. The first response from EAP was, why don't you do a pilot rather than try and do the whole thing? To which my answer was that most of the costs of doing a pilot, there's no saving really. That by the time we got the equipment, set ourselves up in Cameroon, trained someone to do the scanning, then, whether we were scanning 1,000 images or 20,000 images, it really makes little difference. And to EAP's credit, they took the argument, said, fine. So I got the funding to scan 40,000 images. When I then arrived with a team of people from Yaoundé, the capital, to collect the images, we found there were way more boxes than I'd ever seen to begin with. So the same argument, which was that doing a pilot is very little cheaper than doing the whole thing, then acted in my favor, that actually doubling the number of images did not require anything like doubling the cost of the grant. And so with a very small top-up grant, we were able to do everything. And what we did was we took the images, all the old negatives and, well, the boxes, because there were some prints, we took them to Yaoundé, the capital, where we worked with the British Council, who then still had offices there, and they gave us space. So the negatives were scanned, and then in the process of the scanning, they were then put in proper archival sleeving and then returned to the photographer. And having been scanned, the logistics of this got quite complicated. Having been scanned, we made duplicate DVDs. One set of DVDs went to the photographer, so he had everything right from the start. The other set came back to me, and I did all the boring things like look at every single image and make sure they were the right way up.
That's the fun stuff, David. That's the fun stuff.
It was, absolutely. But I have done a sum about how long it takes to look at every single one of the 40, I think we've ended up with 48,000 images, and it adds up to something like a fortnight of my life. And probably no one else will ever do that. But that also is why, in the process of doing that, of course, I made notes and kind of noted the reference numbers of the images that I liked, which in a sense became the longest of long lists, which Erica and I ended up discussing. Although I know Erica has been dipping into the British Library version as well.
I have not spent a fortnight of my life doing that, though, but
No.
but you can see all of them on the website. It's really incredible. You know, this, what you've brought up here, David, actually leads me to a question going off script a little bit for Sam, mentioning DVDs and sort of thinking about technology. And I'm just wondering, Sam, if the EAP has sort of thought about, you know, that you guys are the long-term storage for a lot of, for these archives. Is there a thought towards updating the technology and continuing those partnerships with the host institutions in the countries of origin? Is that sort of an ongoing relationship?
That's a very good question, and it is something I've been thinking about, because we traditionally haven't necessarily kept that relationship. So particularly because EAP funds the people who apply to us, such as David, who then will have that relationship. And we don't necessarily, those people will sometimes often move on to something quite different, and we don't necessarily sort of keep that three-way connection there. So I think it's a very important point. The whole sort of philosophy in a way for EAP is that we're trying to support the work on the ground itself. So really those archive images should stay and be preserved in the country. So to actually sort of do a kind of health check kind of 10 years on would certainly be a good idea, and something I'm thinking about. And it's definitely something to raise with our funder Arcadia, who kind of, well, as you may know, Arcadia has other programs as well. So they also fund, for example, the Endangered Languages Documentation Program, which is run from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. and a number of others like that, which all have the same kind of model and the same ethos. And the question, as you say, of preservation of digital material in the country of origin is something which I think we need to sort of return to Arcadia and look at in the long term. Yeah.
So Sam, I'm going to ask you one final question as we're wrapping up. We have a couple minutes left. Now, of course, removing David's project with Toussele from the equation, if there's a favorite project, a really exciting project that you want to share with us, that something that we could go to the EAP's website to look at, just anything that has really gotten you most impassioned in your work there.
Well, I was just reviewing our many excellent other projects in West Africa, and I realize we're running out of time, but I have three, and okay. I'll be quick. So the first was a series of projects in Djenné in Mali, working on really important ancient manuscripts, as important as those in Timbuktu, although perhaps less well known. And these have been under threat from numerous things, including the activities of ISIS in Mali. So these have been really important projects, working with local people. They were in the collections of local people, but they've been moved to the Djenné manuscript library, where they're now relatively safe, but also now digitized and preserved in that way. Another one in Western Africa is in Ghana. We've got the archives of the Nzema people, which are archives of pre-colonial periods, documents, maps, documenting traditional rule, the chiefdoms, oral acts and things like that, going right through the period from the colonial period through to independence and the post-colonial period, and just a real microcosm of culture here, but so important and something that would have been lost, I think, without preservation. And thirdly, one that I actually revisit many times is from Guinea, the Xylophone Archives, which is one of our sound projects. And Xylophone was a record label set up in post-independent Guinea to preserve kind of traditional and emerging music, with pop music and traditional orchestras. And this was on reel-to-reel formats, which was kind of decaying. So this was an initiative by Graham Council, who ran 3 different projects to digitize this material. And now all these recordings are both preserved, but also available to listen to on the British Library website. And there's some great stuff there. So those are just 3 in West Africa, just to look at some favorites.
That sounds great.
Along with the Cameroonian photo archives.
Along with the Cameroonian photo archives. You have all different types of media available. It's really an incredible project.
Thank you. I invite Erica and David to join me for Q&A. We've got just about 10 minutes left in the program for question and answer. So we'll get right into it. And of course, audience, you can't ask Sam any questions since he's not here, but if you do have any questions for Sam, you can contact the Endangered Archives program at the British Library directly, or you can contact the sister program, the Modern Endangered Archives program, which is housed at the UCLA Library. So I'm going to start with the first question about the size and the format of photographs produced for the photographer's clients. What do we know about how they might have been presented in the home? This person is assuming that they were, more than snapshots and were intended to have a larger presence. So do we know anything about that?
Yeah. I mean, I've done work in people's houses. I've done work with people talking about their photo albums. So, what to say? So the identity card photographs, of course, were printed in passport style sizes. So 2 by 2 centimeters, but often larger versions of the same photograph, the same negative, were printed either to put in albums, so standard end print size, or in some cases blown up large to put on walls. So Muafa Pierre, whose photograph we saw with his wife with the wonderful loopy loopy hairstyle, that photograph is on their wall, or was when I visited about 10 years ago. So there's a mixed economy of different sizes of images, and these get circulated. In some cases, things like marriage certificate photographs are reprinted to make visiting cards, like Christmas cards, and sent to people. So there's a huge mix of uses. Yeah.
Yeah, and we really, in planning out the exhibition, we thought about these various sizes, and we really wanted to use that sort of guide how we printed these, because we're working from the negatives, and we were working, we didn't crop them. You know, I think, you know, the photographers would have cropped these when they were printing them. So we were printing just the full negative, and we tried to keep them to this more domestic size, basically, that, you know, this isn't something that you would have blown up for a museum necessarily. It is something that you would have on your wall. And so we kept them approximately 14 by 14 when we printed them for the gallery, so people would get that sense of the sort of the personal relationship that you have with these images.
But we do have a few prints which were either test prints, or in some cases actually things which were commissioned but never collected, and that does give us guides to how they had been originally printed and how they had been cropped.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. So we've got a couple questions here about the identity of the sitters. We have someone who's pointing out that some of the subjects are identified by name and some not. Is this simply luck of the draw, or does it differ by image types, i.e. like identity cards versus events? And then there's someone else who's asking, apart from the photographers doing self-portraits, you know, how can the other sitters be identified?
It's the bottom line is it's luck of the draw.
Yeah.
So with Toussele, no, not with Toussele, with Chila and Finlak, they work in smaller places, and particularly Finlak is in quite a small rural village, and it was a lot easier to get names for people in the photographs. As you get into larger places, it was just harder, a sort of 30-year remove, for people to remember and recognize photographs. So particularly in the, that affects the number of names we had for the Chila archive. In the Toussele archive, the photographer himself was alive and active when we were doing the main documentation part of the project, and he helped, but I mean, he didn't know the names of many of his clients. Someone would turn up, have his photograph taken, come back a few days later and collect the print. You didn't need to record the name in order to do this. And so, I mean, obviously when it's a chief of one of the sub villages outside Buda, fine. What actually Jacques remembered was this was the chief of Babete. I had to go to Babete to find out what that chief was called. What else? Yeah, so luck of the draw. Oh, let me answer another question actually, because it kind of relates to this. How were these photographers selected? It's sort of snowball sampling. I started in one little village and was where there wasn't a photographer, and when I asked who took the photographs, I was pointed at Finlak in one direction, Chila in the other, and then Chila led me to Toussele, as I've explained. Which one do you want to do?
Thank you so much. Someone says thank you for this amazing exhibit, and are there any plans to share these digital materials with the National Museum or Regional Museum in Cameroon? And can this kind of project be undertaken again?
Well, yeah, so the answer to that question is it's already been done. Copies of all the scans went to the Cameroon National Archives. University of Chang, University of Bamenda, University of Endangered, and there's somewhere, I can't remember where, it was British Council, which is now closed. But that's been done. And yes, you can do more. I know that pilot funding has just been given by the Modern Endangered Archive program from UCLA for someone to work with another Cameroonian photographer. So I hope that will lead to a larger project in due course.
And do you guys have any idea what sort of film or cameras the photographers were using?
Yes. Well, they're medium format, so 120s. So the negatives are nice and big, which is why when they haven't got damaged, the quality is so high. In a few cases, you can see the camera in the photograph taken by other photographers. And Jacques talked about a Photax camera, which was a French manufactured one from a group photograph showing other photographers. You can identify a Chinese seagull camera, I think it's called, which was basically a Chinese version of a Rolleiflex. So it's a twin reflex camera. Which one do you want to do next?
Well, I like this question about photographers with apprentices. Did they have apprentices working for them who would rove outside the studio or capture content in some other manner?
Yeah, well, Toussele had lots of apprentices. Finlak, as far as I know, none. Chila, too. It's partly a thing about scale, that Buda was a far bigger town and so could accommodate this. And as Erica mentioned, the Toussele and his apprentices with the motorcycle and then later a car would go to outlying villages and on their market days and kind of service the people in those villages that way by rolling up with a rolled up backdrop and a bit of lino, and that's when lots of people posed with a motorcycle, including young women, I should say. Not only Erica said it, lots of men, but there are lots of women posing with motorcycles too. One of the kind of nice things is there are photographs taken by apprentices which were sent back to Toussele to mark when they opened their own studios. For example, there was one in Yokoduma, as well as in Chila in Mayodale, and another one of the apprentices who actually helped us in the archiving project by cleaning the damaged negatives. He ended up working for the Cameroon Ministry of Information as a professional photographer. So so yeah, the apprentices went everywhere.
Awesome. Well, that's all we have time for today, but we got through quite a few. Good job, guys. Thank you so much to both of you guys for sharing such interesting behind the scenes information about this exhibition.
Our pleasure.
Thank you to everyone who participated in this celebration today, joining us online. If you're local, we hope that you will come to the Fowler soon to check out the exhibition for yourself. It's up through the beginning of December, and we'd love for you to join us at the museum to see it for yourself in person, in real time, in a real space. And this program has been recorded. It's going to be available immediately on our Facebook and in the next few days on our Instagram and on the Fowler website for everyone to revisit and share as they see fit. And we hope that everyone will join us for our next program. Details can be found on the closing slide. And in the meantime, we hope that you guys have a great weekend. Thank you for joining us today.
Bye.
Bye.